Deep in the heart of Sinaloa, Mexico, a cartel boss lounges in his sprawling mansion, barking orders into a satellite phone. Outside, guards lean on fortified walls, casually smoking cigarettes, completely unaware of what's coming. High above them, a U.S. Mojave drone is about to unleash the full load of 16 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles directly at them. In minutes, nearly 1,800 pounds of precision-guided destruction could wipe the entire compound off the map. This is exactly how a U.S. war on the cartels might begin. And let's be clear, up against the might of the U.S. military, the cartels would be trying to shoot down missiles with metaphorical pea shooters. So why hasn't the U.S. pulled the trigger? Well, the answer is more complicated than it seems, and we'll break it all down on today's episode of the Infographic Show. What's stopping the U.S. Army from going to war with the Mexican cartels? Number 8. Legality. There are two main ways a U.S. attack on the cartels inside Mexican territory could be executed. The first option would be waves of air-to-ground strikes using missiles and/or drones to target cartel leaders, bases, infrastructure, fentanyl labs, and other assets. Alternatively, special forces could be deployed on the ground to attack and take out a similar set of cartel assets. There is a third option, which would hit the cartels where it hurts the most, without a shot needing to be fired, as we'll reveal later on. But if the U.S. wants to carry out kinetic military operations in the sovereign territory of Mexico, there are several important considerations from a legal perspective. Attacks would almost certainly be considered lawful across the board if they happen with the full consent of the Mexican government. But that seems unlikely. Current President Claudia Sheinbaum has adopted a much tougher stance against the cartels than her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. She has arrested scores of alleged traffickers, made record busts of fentanyl and other illicit drugs, and shipped 29 purported cartel capos to the United States to face trial. She's also agreed to step up U.S. military and CIA surveillance flights over Mexico in a bid to gather intelligence on cartel operations. However, direct U.S. military action in Mexico would cross all of her red lines. In April 2025, she said Mexico would defend its sovereignty against violations by land, sea, or air. U.S. military activities in Mexico without its consent will also be extremely unpopular among the Mexican people, creating new problems for the U.S. But such an action is also likely to be a breach of international law and could set legal precedents that are damaging for the U.S. down the line. There are essentially three scenarios under which a nation can lawfully use force against or inside another state. They are when the UN Security Council, or UNSC, has authorized that force, when the other state has given consent, or when the first state is acting in self-defense. With Russia and China having veto powers in the UNSC, option 1 is in all likelihood off the table from the start. As we've already discussed, Mexican consent is just as unlikely. That leaves self-defense or anticipatory self-defense as the only possible justification under international law. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, a state's right to self-defense is triggered by an armed attack or an imminent armed attack. From a legal standpoint, the U.S. believes that it can use force in self-defense inside another country, but only under specific conditions. One of those conditions is if the host country is unwilling or unable to deal with the threat itself. In this case, if Mexico can't or won't take strong enough action against the cartels, the U.S. could justify stepping in. But even then, any U.S. military action would have to meet two key standards. It must be necessary to stop the threat and proportional to the level of danger involved. If members of a Mexican cartel attacked a U.S. consulate, killing, injuring, or holding American personnel hostage, the U.S. would have a strong legal case for using force in response. The same would apply if DEA agents or other U.S. officials working in Mexico were kidnapped or killed while cooperating with the Mexican government. However, any military operations would need to be both necessary and proportional. They would be limited to the goal of rescuing those in danger and removing them from the threatening situation. Before acting, the United States would need to prove that Mexico is unwilling or unable to address the threat to those U.S. nationals. There's a strong case for that, given how the cartels have grown and flourished in Mexico over the past 2 decades. But can the volume of fentanyl they produce that's brought into the U.S. be considered an armed attack? After all, the drug causes untold death and suffering. In 2021, 107,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses, not to mention the damage done to millions of addicts and their families. But is that enough to justify crossing the border and taking out cartel labs, leaders, and so on, considering all the other potential negative consequences we're about to discuss? Probably not. By taking this view, the U.S. will set very disadvantageous precedents for itself. There are serious legal risks if the U.S. tries to justify military force by labeling cartel activity as an armed attack. For one, it undermines the U.S.'s own long-standing argument that economic sanctions aren't considered uses of force, even though in terms of downstream harm, sanctions can resemble the effects of fentanyl. More importantly, if the U.S. sets a precedent that force is justified based on indirect harms of drug trafficking, it opens up a legal can of worms. What's to stop future governments or other countries from using that logic to justify strikes against alcohol producers, tobacco companies, or even junk food manufacturers linked to public health crises? Number 7. Diplomatic consequences. Attacking the cartels could be seen by the international community as flouting international law and setting dangerous precedents. This is likely to severely damage the U.S.'s international standing on many levels. Its reputation as a champion of international law would be severely tarnished. Relations with many states would be damaged, affecting trade and investments. International treaties and bilateral agreements could be jeopardized. Turmoil in the markets would be baked in. American businesses and consumers would suffer as a result, potentially causing social unrest and political upheaval back at home. Think tariff blowback on steroids. Number 6. Damaging the relationship with Mexico. Relationships with many nations are likely to be severely strained as a result of the attacks on cartels in Mexico, but none of them is as dangerous for the U.S. as Mexico. There's a strong case to be made that the cartels are an even bigger scourge for Mexico than the U.S. However, to expect the Mexicans to welcome U.S. strikes or an invasion from up north is unrealistic. Declaring total war on Mexican cartels would fundamentally affect the very fabric of the country. The industry of narcotics trafficking is widely believed to be one of the top employers in Mexico and contributes billions to its economy annually. Numerous politicians, military officials, soldiers, police, and business leaders have been exposed as being on their payroll, with countless others implicated. Beyond the estimated 175,000 people working for them, cartels enjoy regional support in some areas and function as a kind of shadow narco state. So taking out the cartels would hit millions of ordinary Mexicans right in their pockets. And many innocent civilians are also likely to be hit by bullets, missiles, grenades, and drones, inflaming public outrage. Mexican officials and the Mexican people have long memories, and they recall clearly what they consider the numerous bullying episodes by the Colossus of the North in both the 19th and 20th centuries. Even a limited U.S. military involvement in Mexico would revive those memories and feelings of resentment, and there is likely to be plenty of innocent blood spilled. Much of cartel infrastructure is located in commercial and civilian areas, often right in the middle of cities and residential neighborhoods. If previous clashes between Mexican forces and cartels are anything to go by, we can expect scenes of streets littered with burning vehicles and bodies strewn across the streets. The estimated 37 million Mexican Americans living in the U.S. will be foremost among the outraged. That raises the prospect of protests, strikes, and legal action against the administration on U.S. soil, which could easily spread to other segments of the Hispanic American community and beyond. And if the U.S.'s actions disrupt the Mexican economy substantially, the ranks of Mexican Americans are likely to be greatly swelled by a massive wave of immigrants heading across the U.S. border. And the U.S. could certainly do without any inflammation of an already chronic illegal immigration problem, which in this case would be entirely self-inflicted. Number 5. Economic considerations. Under previous U.S. administrations, immigration thresholds were used to trigger action at the southern border. If the daily number of attempted crossings reached 4,000, Homeland Security had the authority to restrict most entries. But if it hit 5,000 per day, a border shutdown became mandatory. Still, that flow of immigrants cost the U.S. billions of dollars, though the exact amount is disputed, although one organization put the cost at $150.7 billion in 2023 alone. So how much extra will a new massive wave of caravans heading across the border cost the current administration? It has set cutting government spending and tackling immigration as two of its main priorities, after all. But the economic consequences of a U.S. attack on Mexican territory won't end there. In 2024, Mexico was the largest trading partner of the United States, importing $334 billion and exporting $506 billion worth of goods and services, for a total of $840 billion. If, as expected, Mexico reacts strongly to the U.S.'s attacks on its territory, that trade is likely to be severely disrupted, creating all manner of supply chain problems. That will undoubtedly cause prices on all kinds of basic goods like energy, electronic equipment, and vehicles to rise for the American public already reeling from several years of high inflation. Number 4. Risks of retaliation. The average Joe is also highly unlikely to be thrilled about Americans turning up in body bags as a result of U.S. attacks on the cartels. That is practically a certainty because the cartels are too large, too spread out, and powerful to be taken out with a narrow range of targeted strikes and/or surgical commando ops. They will almost certainly survive the initial wave of attacks, and then they'll retaliate. First in the line of fire are likely to be soft targets like U.S. tourists and diplomatic targets inside Mexico. To date, to avoid provoking U.S. retaliation, cartel attacks on U.S. law enforcement and civilians have been rare. But if the U.S. attacks them, history strongly suggests that the gloves will come off. Soon after Felipe Calderón became president of Mexico in 2006, he declared a war on drugs and deployed military forces against cartels. The result was a sharp escalation in violence. The cartels retaliated by targeting law enforcement, military personnel, and government officials. Entire police forces resigned in fear, and public officials were assassinated in broad daylight. What's more, the cartels have a history of perpetrating gruesome, symbolic ISIS-style acts of terrorism to terrify and intimidate both law enforcement and the general population alike. That includes executing victims and leaving them next to busy highways, and distributing snuff videos of their macabre executions on social media. The longer a conflict with them endures, the more likely it is that the bodies of U.S. troops and civilians start appearing on U.S. news shows and in viral videos. The outrage that this provokes may stimulate mass support for further U.S. attacks. However, it's more likely that the outrage will be directed at the U.S. government for creating the mess in the first place. But the cartels are also capable of retaliating on U.S. soil. Their extensive drug trafficking networks stretch to cities like Los Angeles and Chicago, as well as rural communities. This provides them with the infrastructure and manpower for potential retaliatory strikes. Cartels have a history of assassinating government officials in Mexico, and they would likely adopt the same terrorist tactics in the U.S. That means car bombs, snipers, and drones taking out political figures, law enforcement leaders, and military personnel and their families on U.S. streets. Extensive cartel connections to Chinese underground banking and U.S.-based gangs could readily facilitate such actions inside the U.S. So attacking the cartels in Mexico runs a serious risk of sparking an unprecedented terrorist campaign on U.S. soil. But the threat doesn't end with physical attacks. Cartels would also likely engage in cyber operations to gather information on potential targets. Target acquisition tools range from access to online government databases to real-time cell phone geolocation. Small drones and signal jammers are used to cover the tracks of illegal activities on both sides of the border. Their financial power also enables them to influence local politics and law enforcement through intimidation and corruption. If a cartel were to launch a cyber attack on a U.S. government agency, forcing it to suspend normal operations, the ripple effects could be massive. The disruption wouldn't just affect the agency itself, it could paralyze services impacting local communities, driving Americans to call for operations against the cartels in Mexico to stop. Number 3. Militarily counterproductive. Those calls will only grow if it looks like the U.S. is failing to achieve its military objectives in Mexico. Based on statements from the U.S. administration, those objectives are primarily eliminating cartel leadership and destroying fentanyl production. Both run the serious risk of exacerbating the fentanyl problem in the U.S. rather than solving it. The U.S. will likely succeed in killing the leaders of the cartels it targets, but history suggests that is not going to stop their activities. Colombia's drug war proved to be like cutting the head off a hydra, only to have 2 new ones grow back. The Medellin cartel's fall led to the rise of the Cali cartel, whose own demise allowed the FARC rebels and a series of paramilitary groups to take over the cocaine business. A similar situation has been observed in Mexico. Decapitation strikes tend to create a leadership vacuum, triggering infighting among cartel factions vying to replace the last leader. That inevitably results in an elevated state of violence and insecurity, which will create even more problems for the U.S. military to solve. That means more time and boots on the ground. With the expense and body count growing by the day, the longer the operation goes on, the greater the likelihood of the U.S. getting sucked into another forever war like Afghanistan, with an ever-diminishing rate of return. Is the U.S. public ready for yet another war? This time just over the border as opposed to halfway across the world? It's a big consideration for the administration. However, the objective of destroying fentanyl production is even more fraught with the risks of counterproductive results. The idea behind attacking the drug supply at the source in this way is that it'll reduce availability and drive prices up, which in turn will reduce consumption and the associated negative consequences back home. However, the U.S.'s experience in trying to attack cocaine production in Colombia suggests that the theory doesn't quite play out like that in practice. The U.S. spent almost $12 billion in Colombia to assist the Colombian military in eradicating coca leaf and undermining actors participating in the cocaine trade between 2000 and 2015. But prices stayed relatively flat, And all that taxpayer money did nothing to halt the spread of coca crops, illicit drug production, or the continuous export of cocaine to the U.S. On the contrary, coca cultivation in Colombia increased between 2000 and 2020 from roughly 336,000 acres planted in 2000 to a record 605,000 acres in 2020. And cocaine production is infinitely easier to attack than fentanyl production. Number 2. The fentanyl will keep flowing regardless. Compared to cocaine, fentanyl is produced on a much smaller scale with comparatively tiny amounts of precursor chemicals that are easy to obtain. And China is all too keen to keep shipping as much of that base ingredient to the cartels as they can handle. Fentanyl can be produced in significant quantities almost anywhere. A lab can be set up in as little as half an hour in an apartment, basement, or even as revealed in a PBS feature, in the middle of a field full of cows. It's also a relatively quick and easy process to cook it up, and getting it into the US is easy as well. Around 86% is being brought into the country by US citizens. Blow up as many labs as you want, and more will spring up before the debris has been cleared. That's due to the eye-watering profit margins. Just $800 of fentanyl precursor chemicals can produce up to $640,000 of retail value in the US cities. Even if the US attacks disrupt operations enough to cut into those margins meaningfully, they are large enough to absorb huge amounts of pressure and still be extremely lucrative. And that means that even if the US managed to destroy the fentanyl flow from Mexico, there's little reason to believe US supply would evaporate. Besides Mexico, it's already coming from countries like China, Canada, India, Nigeria, Indonesia, Myanmar, and the Netherlands, albeit in much smaller quantities. And with a huge gap in the market vacated by the Mexican cartels, the next major producer could be literally anywhere else. Number 1. Plan B? So all things considered, it's completely understandable why the US hasn't attacked the cartels with military force yet, and may never do so. The risk-benefit analysis simply doesn't add up. But maybe there's a more effective way of cutting them off at the knees. Ultimately, despite their proclivity for wanton violence, the cartels are not a terrorist group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They're not motivated by killing all infidels, conquering territory, or eschatological insanity. They're in it almost entirely for the money. So the place to hit them where they'll hurt the most is directly in the bottom line. If millions of Americans didn't willingly abuse fentanyl, the cartels would be out of the fentanyl business without a shot needing to be fired. In that sense, the best way to solve both the fentanyl and cartel problems in one fell swoop might be for the US to legalize it and make it available at prices way below the cartel's break-even point, even for free. If the cartel's profit dries up, so will their interest in the trade. Of course, this is a highly controversial proposition that comes with its own set of risks. But if the US were to force the fentanyl trade out of the shadows to where it can be controlled and regulated, the cartel's fentanyl business model would be shattered irreparably. Quality could be controlled, eliminating the often fatal effects of impurities and toxins in badly cooked products. And addicts could be more effectively weaned onto less harmful analogs like methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. These medications interact with the same opioid receptors in the brain but do not produce the same effects, which goes a long way to managing withdrawal symptoms and cravings. Instead of blowing billions of dollars on a war where the risks are many, the US could invest in fentanyl education, mitigation, and rehabilitation programs. Instead of raining down violence, this could be a cunning plan B to deal with the fentanyl problem once and for all. Now go check out Times Cartels Messed with the Wrong People, or click on this video instead.